Hey everyone, thanks for coming out. My name is Patrick Hart. I'm a composer from Los Angeles. Appreciate you coming to the talk. I'm going to talk today about procedural music, how you can compose it, how you can avoid some common pitfalls while composing it, and how you can creatively use Unreal Engine audio features to make it good. I'll be showing you some examples from a piece I created called Cycles. Cycles was commissioned by California State Parks and the Mountain Parks Foundation. I built it in Unreal. It is available for free on Steam and the Epic Games Store, so please check it out. The talk is structured as follows. I'll give a brief overview of Cycles and what procedural music is, then dive into examples from Cycles, starting with the first phase of the piece, continuing with more from the first phase of the piece. This is the comprehensive part. And then some examples from the other three phases, and then wrap up and take some questions. Quickly, a little bit about myself. This is my first Unreal Fest. Super happy to be here. I've done a lot of work as a composer in film, TV, commissioned pieces, and I've also worked as a graphic and motion designer. More recently, I've been exploring the intersection of procedural music, interactive art, and games, including in my current role as a technical music designer at Aria Labs, where we are building a top secret music project, which I would be happy to tell you about later off the record. Okay, Cycles is an audiovisual piece. It continually produces new compositions. These are 100% procedurally generated in native Unreal Audio. It's a solo dev project that I built in Unreal and released again for free on Steam and the Epic Store. Here is the trailer. So, Cycles is a procedural music piece. It is minimally interactive. You can change some things about each generation, but it's not a game. The piece kind of performs itself. And it repeats indefinitely. Every generation is unique. So let me quickly address a concern some of you may be having right now, which is, but I'm not trying to compose a minimally interactive procedural music piece that repeats indefinitely. And if that's going through your head right now, don't worry, that's not really like the purpose of the talk. Cycles is also kind of a proof of concept. I wanted to create a piece, a music and sonic experience that was natively procedural. So working in Unreal, I wanted to deeply integrate the built-in procedural audio features into the creative process from the beginning. And this is a goal that I'm sure I share with a lot of you. And everything I'll show you today is totally compatible with games and interactive art. That was something that I wanted to get out of this piece too. So what I want to do today is think about how to use these features creatively, how to compose with these features. And even if you don't fancy yourself a composer, if you're making sound, if you're facilitating a player making sound, if you're designing systems that make sound, then you are making composition decisions. So I want to come back to this in a moment, but first, let's make sure we're on the same page with a quick overview of procedural music. I'll explain what it is, then I want to focus on one big problem people have creating procedural music and one concept I use to deal with this problem. All right, what is procedural music? It is music created by a system or a set of rules. So what is a rule that makes music? Here's an easy one. Play this note on a piano repeatedly. That is a rule, and it will make you a piece of music. So then what if you want more notes? I can tweak the rule to be play any note on a piano repeatedly. And now, we have encountered a very powerful aspect of procedural music, but also the one big aforementioned problem. So a system like this is really easy to create in a lot of ways. Here's an example built in MetaSounds in Unreal. Great, right? So what's the problem? The music goes on forever to infinity. You'll never have to listen to any other music ever again. There is no problem. Okay, the problem here, and the problem with a lot of procedural music, is randomness. So randomness is a very powerful tool to generate new material, but you have to shape it and filter it and compose with it to create something that's worth listening to if you're a human. Humans tend to listen to music with all kinds of patterns and repetition, pitches with frequency relationships, songs with verses and choruses. Humans do not typically enjoy a stream of sonified random numbers. So a concept that I like to use to combat this issue I will call controlled variance. This is an important concept, so it gets a hat. We don't just want to drink in unadulterated randomness, but we do want to permit some variance. That's what will allow our music to adapt, to surprise, to produce inspiring and serendipitous moments. It can keep it from being formulaic. And when you're controlling the variance, another way to rephrase that is that you are composing the randomness. You're making a decision about how to use randomness in a way that helps your aesthetic goals. So even though, as we will see, the random node is your friend, you don't just want to plug the random node into your speakers. You want to plug the random node into your cool composer stuff node and plug that into your speakers. You'll see a lot of systems that I'll show you built with the exact same components that I just showed you in that sort of nonsense random demo that hopefully sound a lot more musical and expressive. And this is kind of what it means to compose procedural music, to sort of shape these systems. All right, with that in mind, let's take a look at some examples from cycles. So last year in summer 2023, I was invited along with a group of artists to Big Basin Redwood State Park, where we were commissioned to create art in response to wildfires that had burned through the park in 2020. I go backpacking a lot in California, and so I encounter fire a lot. And this has been kind of a difficult and new thing for me, so I wanted to use this piece as an opportunity to view fire as a natural part of the life cycle of a forest, not just the end of the forest. So the form of cycles kind of mimics that of a forest life cycle. The piece divides into 4 phases, roughly modeled after a period of rapid growth, young forest taking hold, mature forest, and fire. This form is set up in blueprints. It's very simple. Each phase is just an event that triggers all the audio stuff and starts a timeline. When that timeline finishes, it triggers the next event for the next phase. At the end, it starts a new, unique cycle and displays an interstitial graphic with some information about the cycle. After you watch a couple of iterations, you kind of see the end of one cycle as the beginning of the next, or at least that is my artistic message. Okay, phase 1. So if you go into a forest a little bit after a fire, you see all this black burned wood, but also all this bright neon green, because so many new things are growing as fast as possible and competing for all this new sunlight. So for phase 1, I wanted to structure it like this initial bang with a flurry of activity, and then add in this sense of layering growth. So let's take a look at the flurry of activity first. Here's a graph of what we want to do. Lots of activity, decreasing over time to 0. This is the contour of what we want, and I end up thinking about contours in procedural music all the time. You can generate a contour and then use that to generate notes, timings, patterns, etc. that fit the contour. So how do we generate this contour? I'm sure that many of the audio savvy among us here saw this and immediately thought of the correct answer, which is to use an envelope. So we have envelope nodes in MetaSounds, and we don't just have to use them to control a VCA or a filter cutoff or other regular synthesizer things. To create this activity flurry, I'm using it in conjunction with a trigger repeat node. This is a pattern I use all the time to just kind of generate notes out of thin air. Trigger repeat is just a metronome, and each pulse I'm using to play back an audio file. Audio files are wood samples because it is a woodsy piece. The envelope controls the repeat time, so at the top of the envelope, we get very dense onsets, then more sparse over time until the envelope reaches 0. Here is the full patch, which includes some parameter randomization, and I'm rotating between 3 wave players so the notes don't get cut off, 3-voice polyphony. Let's take a listen. Cool, just gonna hear the envelope. So using contours, you can add a lot of variation while still creating these phrases that feel related. Remember, that's an important thing to your listener's ear, where the ear is just trying to grab things with a musical relationship. So for another approach to this idea, let's look at this play opening chord patch, which plays a chord, and sometimes also plays a little marimba melody. Okay, so before we listen to this, let's think. How do melodies work with music like this? How do you compose a melody procedurally? For that matter, how do you compose a melody at all? And I think there's a common sentiment that melodies should be intuitive, like a good melody just comes to you. And honestly, this is a totally valid way to compose. You train your brain on every piece of music you've ever heard, you point your brain antenna at the sky, and you wait for the melodies to beam in. And everyone who writes music has these inexplicable moments of inspiration, and that's great, but it's a difficult thing to encode into a system. It's also a difficult way to work under a deadline, which is why for centuries, composers have devised methods of working which don't require divine intervention. These methods are going to work better for us composing procedurally. So back to my opening melody generator, I wanted it to produce melodies that were fluid in tempo, kind of speeding up and slowing down freely. And I wanted the melodies to progress generally upward, winding their way up in pitch. So to create note onsets that can freely speed up and slow down, I'm again using a contour. And if we graph the frequency of note onsets over time, all of you wonderful audio people will see how it's done, and that is with an LFO. Again, we connect this to a trigger repeat, same pattern as with our flurry of activity before with the envelope. And the way I'm generating pitch is really simple. Each note, I just add a random value, which is in this case between -6 and 10, to the previous note. So because the high intervals are bigger, we get this naturally ascending pitch contour, but it's still kind of loose. So let's listen to a couple of these. You can see I only changed the seed to get a new melody, which is called foreshadowing. Change the seed. Cool. So although this patch is very simple, and I'll show you the insides to prove that it is 90% wires by volume, it generates some really pretty results from just a couple of core ideas. And I think this is a good opportunity to take a detour to discuss how these core ideas become personality in procedural music. Like a really beautiful thing is that as you think up your own rules and add them to your system, this is how you're adding your own voice to your music. It really does start to sound like you. There's a game dev and composer whose work I absolutely love, who goes by Niflis. And Niflis has this concept called awkwardness, where basically there's more awkward intervals and less awkward intervals, and you can dial up a knob to generate music with more awkwardness or less to keep things normal. And I bring this up because it's just this wonderful, quirky little piece of system design, but it translates as musical personality. You hear this as compositional style when you play Niflis's games. Yinglet has my favorite procedural music in a game, and it's also like a great game, so it's worth checking out, I'd say. The last thing going on in phase 1, number 3, are these percussion patterns, which create a sense of growth as they're layered on top of each other. So now that we've shaped a stream of random numbers into a melody, how can we do the same to create a repeating pattern? And to do this, we just use a simple feature, which is like the foundation of all procedural generation, and that is random seeds. And a fun way to think about random seeds is that we're actually exploiting a deficiency with how computers generate random numbers. They're not truly random, so if you have the starting seed and an algorithm, you can reproduce the entire stream. That is a hint at how we will use it here. So what I'm doing is generating a stream of random binary values where 1 makes a note and 0 does not. And because a seeded random number stream is reproducible, what we can do is just restart the stream after a given number of notes. There's our pattern. We just loop the beginning of the stream. And an amazing thing about MetaSounds is that every node with random number generation has a seed input and a way to reset the seed to its, or reset the stream rather, to its initial value. It's truly designed to support proceduralism. You can also do seeded random number generation in Blueprint or C++. You just need to create a random stream, give that a seed, and use random functions that take the stream as input. So back to our percussion patterns, here's what it sounds like when a handful of these patterns are layered together. Looking inside the patch that makes these patterns, I have a random get node pulling from a probability array, which is filled with 1s and 0s. I'm allowing the 1s to pass through this filter and resetting the random get node at the end of each pattern. And what this allows me to do is say, I want a 12-note pattern with exactly 4 notes in it. And I find this a lot more useful than a node that does say, I want 12 notes with a 33% chance of playing each note, because then you might get some patterns with 10 notes, some with 0, and what I need here is more controlled variance. I trigger the reset at the end of each phrase with this trigger counter, and to create the probability array of 1s and 0s, I have an array of all 1s, an array of all 0s, and I'm concatenating together a subset of each one. Okay, so this is a good moment for another detour to talk about an important choice that you may have to make. And that is, do you want to generate procedural music in real time from one note to the next, or all at once, like you just run a function and it spits out an entire piano sonata as an array or a MIDI file or whatever? And the reason I bring this up now is because some of you are probably looking at this and thinking, I can do this with 2 lines of code, a for loop to create an array, and then we shuffle the array. So why is this so complicated? The answer to why this is so complicated is that MetaSounds are a DSP graph, not a scripting language like blueprints. So you can't loop over something because the entire graph is executing at once every frame. I'm not going to go too into the weeds here. It's a short talk, but suffice it to say, this is everyone's first pitfall when getting into MetaSounds. Dan Reynolds has a great video explaining this and other general MetaSound concepts. It's called Understanding MetaSounds. Check it out if you want to dig into this further. It's very good. Okay, so where then do you put your logic? The pros for putting logic in blueprints or C++ are pretty simple and boil down to do all this stuff in 2 lines of code. It's very clean, whatever. The pros, on the other hand, for putting logic in MetaSounds, a little more wishy-washy, but include no dependencies. And this is like a loose definition of dependencies here. But you don't have to rely on a function outside of your MetaSound that, like, for example, generates an array of notes and feeds it in. And then this means that you can throw this patch into another MetaSound and put that in another MetaSound. Everything is self-contained. You're not keeping track of all these layers where you have to pipe an array of notes. It can be easier to prototype. The dependency thing is one reason, but also it can be easier to conceptualize and debug a patch when you're thinking about, like, okay, what happens if I change this right now? You can do some real-time improvisation in a patch. You don't have to kind of understand the entire composition right from the start. For the same reason, it can be easier to conceptualize, accommodate, and compose for interaction. And then finally, clock stuff. We can schedule sample-accurate notes with quartz, but MetaSounds can send all kinds of data with sample accuracy. You may gain a bit of flexibility depending on what you're trying to do, being inside MetaSounds. Most likely, you will want to put some logic in code, especially like looping array stuff, but you'll end up keeping some stuff in MetaSounds. This is pretty much what I did in cycles, although I leaned a little heavier on the MetaSounds side. Okay, now that we have these patterns, how can we progressively layer them on top of each other and make sure everything's in time? So we could cram lots of things into one MetaSound, because again, clock stuff, but the classy way to keep time in Unreal is quartz. So although my patterns layer in, I'm actually queuing them all up at once when a new cycle starts. And to do that, I use the quantization multiplier input in conjunction with current time relative on this quartz quantization boundary. So if I play a pattern with a multiplier of 10, it will start exactly 10 eighth notes after the current eighth note. And so by running this function a handful of times with random values, I get this nice layering effect as everything comes in, but everything is totally locked in time to multiples of eighth notes. So it's a simple trick, but if you search for videos of quartz setups, there is understandably a heavy focus on music systems, getting your tracks to loops and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of unexplored creative space here, especially combining things like this with procedural music sources. Okay, so let's talk quickly about the process of using all these components to build a piece of music, and specifically how some Unreal features can make this process better. A strategy I use a lot with procedural music is basically modular composing, where I try to keep things like note generators, modifiers, and synthesizers in small pieces that I can combine and test really easily. In Unreal, it's super easy to hook these pieces up in different ways in blueprints and set up hardware inputs to test things out in real time. And this seems trivial, like a game engine can handle input, but for a musician working in a DAW like Pro Tools or whatever, you would just kill for this kind of flexibility. So here's a test with the activity flurries, the little envelope thing from before. I wanted to see how many patches of these I could stack before it got like too crazy. So I set up the number keys on my keyboard to do this, along with some simple functions that create and set up all the audio components. Here, let's check it out. It's done. So based on this demo, I ended up limiting the total number of layers to 6. And so that kind of gets at what the composition process for this piece was, which was a lot of testing the variance to find the extremes of what I wanted to allow, and then trying to make that space in the middle as rich as possible. Creating tests like this can help you get the controlled variance that you want. So I'll show one other similar demo of the patterns where when I press spacebar, I'm just changing the random seed on every patch that's playing. I think this is a nice demonstration of the power of seeded random patterns. You can seamlessly transition to a new complex pattern like every time a player defeats an enemy or jumps onto a platform or whatever. Each pattern is derived from one single seed value, just like one number. Because these patterns are perfectly synced to the quartz clock, you can just as easily pair them with composed, pre-composed, non-procedural linear music tracks. As far as I know, no laws against that. All right, so we arrived at phase 2. So in phase 1, we had this burst of activity. And in phase 2, what I wanted to have happen was have some structure kind of emerge from this chaos. So let's take a listen for the piece. Cool. So this groove kind of kicks in and it feels new, but it's not jarring based on what we just heard. In fact, it's basically created from the same pieces I used for phase one, which is a nice demonstration of modular composing. This section kind of emerged organically from assembling some pieces in a patch, tweaking parameters, and getting like this serendipitous result that I liked. The bulk of phase two lies in a single big meta sound, as we discussed. This is not exactly best practices, but sometimes just a sound you really like just falls into place, and you should have the wisdom to not mess up a good thing. There are several components to phase two, but I want to take a deeper look at this little melodic marimba groove. So previously, we talked about using contours as a simple way to create nice melodies. Here, on the other hand, we are using an even simpler method to generate a melody that honestly, I was kind of surprised that it worked at all, but I think it does. So we already looked at this pattern patch. This is what was generating all those drum patterns that we layered. So what I'm doing is pairing these patterns with a random note number, quantizing the MIDI note to our scale, and playing the notes. It is extremely basic, but the result is pretty coherent. So what makes this work? First of all, several important parameters are limited to nice values. The density of notes feels good. The number of notes in the melody is just the length of the melody divided by 4. So it's not too busy, it's not trying to do too much. The range is also limited. The random notes are within an octave and a half, so it's likely that we'll get some neighboring tones, octave jumps, like other things that nice melodies may have. The length of the melody is also chosen from some limited values. I think there's like 6 possible lengths or something. So we don't get short, repetitive melodies or too long, boring melodies. Another important piece is velocity. So we get some natural accent notes by adding random velocity, and the whole thing becomes more human and believable. And then finally, this quantizer, looks weird, actually does something really sophisticated here. So every time we reset the random number generation, I'm changing the key. And if you're composing traditionally in something like Finale, rest in peace, then the easiest default thing is just to transpose every note in your melody up or down to the new key. So just like add +7 to every note. And this will sound to you like a lazy composer who's past his deadline. So this quantize node is no less lazy for us to use, but it does something much more interesting, which is to only move each individual note a small amount to fit in the new key. It's pretty cool. Let's listen to this groove in the context of the entire patch with all of its other stuff too. It's a nice thing to keep in mind that often you can make a surprisingly simple procedural system, and with that produce complex and interesting results. So if you'll permit me, let's return to an idea that we talked about before, which is how do you procedurally compose a melody? I showed you a couple of very simple examples that just use 1 or 2 core ideas to produce a reasonable melody. So what if you want to take this further? Honestly, the possibilities are endless, and a great way to come up with ideas is just to analyze your favorite melodies, think about how you could reproduce them, and how you can vary that reproduction. But for a few quick ideas, you can draw contours in any number of ways. You could weight intervals, where you might construct a melody out of 10 small intervals and 2 large intervals. Weight time relationships, like do the same thing but with time. Outline harmonies, where your melody follows the voices of different chords. You could use counterpoint. That's like a ton of old rules that you can explore. Like fugues and canons are basically just algorithms. Another idea that can help you improve your procedurally generated melodies are health checks. And this idea is courtesy of John Bell, who I'm fortunate to work with at ARIA Labs. John also wrote this software called Riffler, which is kind of incredible. It does make sick guitar riffs, but also is just like this really polished procedural music generator. So it's worth checking out. I think this health check idea is really fascinating. John generates a melody and then runs it through a series of health checks to see if the melody should be used. He looks at stuff like repeated notes. Repeating an entire section sounds intentional, but if you just have one or two repeated notes, this often comes across as a mistake. Big interval jumps, which he describes as difficult to get right, and dissonant intervals. So all of these things are just like things that can make music feel inhuman. Anyways, Riffler, very cool. Now another detour. Recall before, we're changing the key and scale in this MetaSound patch. I think I took that out, so just believe me. In that marimba melody, we're changing the key and scale inside the MetaSound patch. And other patches outside of this MetaSound are following it. And you might have also noticed in the Phase 2 video that there were photos of the forest that changed every time we heard a new chord, but the chords are also triggered inside of this MetaSound. So how do we get the information out of the MetaSound so it can be used elsewhere? And we do that with the MetaSound output watcher, which is incredibly useful. Previously, all this data was stuck inside the MetaSound where it was generated. Now you can send it to other MetaSounds, drive visuals with it, whatever you want. It's very easy to set up, although it was not obvious to me how to send a trigger outside of a MetaSound, for example, to change the photo on a new chord. So to do this, I just had the chord trigger in the MetaSound generate a new random float, watched this output, and called the photo event when the value changed. Just a small little tip. All right, we're to Phase 3. I want to focus on a very simple patch from Phase 3 so we can shift gears a bit and talk about synthesis. Sometimes your process is just to design a really cool synth. And so this patch does one thing, plays one single synth note. Most of the sounds and cycles are those like acoustic wooden sounds, and this patch might produce the first synthesized sound a listener hears, so it should make a cool synth sound. I named the patch Analog Swell, so you can close your eyes and smell the cigarette burns on the fake wooden user interface. Let's take a quick listen to my one synth note. Cool. So these synthesized notes only appear in a fraction of the generations. They're kind of meant to represent human influence on the forest, so they should sound quite different from the organic wooden sounds, and you don't hear them every time through the piece. The sound is generated by 4 saw oscillators, really 2 stereo pairs of saw oscillators. The top 2 play the note, and the bottom 2 play the note an octave lower. You can see the frequency is multiplied by 0.5, so it's an octave down. It's ultra simple, so how do we give this some interesting flavor? First, we can give the left channel and right channel oscillators a slightly different frequency, so this immediately makes the stereo image super wide. I've also given each pair of oscillators their own LFO, which makes the pitch drift slowly. All of this is running through a low-pass filter, which creates the swell, and for more flavor, a stereo delay, whose delay time is also being slowly modified by an LFO. So let's do a quick comparison. I'll play 2 different notes, first without, and then with all the flavor stuff. So it's really another example of controlled variance. We've got these analog flavor bits, and we control how much we'll allow the pitch to drift away from the target. In fact, most of the time when I design a synth voice, I'll add like an analog input and multiply all this flavor stuff by it, so I can easily scale it up or totally kill it. Okay, phase 4. The idea here in phase 4 is to represent fire, consuming the material that came before it. Immediately, I knew how I'd want to do the consuming, which is to use a special node in MetaSounds, the grain delay. So I'll circle back to the feeding in past material part and first look at how I use the grain delay. The grain delay is a really unique granular processor. It does not have any inputs to control a constant stream of grains. That is because, unusually, it does not have one. You can easily make one by connecting a trigger repeat node to the spawn input, but we can do much more interesting things you can't do anywhere else by spawning grains manually. So here I have 2 grain delays for stereo sound, and I'm feeding a pretty complex stream of triggers into the spawn inputs. I do have trigger repeats feeding in pulses, but at irregular periods, and I'm filtering out some pulses randomly. I also have an envelope controlling a trigger repeat. This is that pattern from all the way back in phase 1 with the activity flurries. Infrequently, it will spawn a flurry of grains. Another envelope infrequently turns up the level on this stereo delay, which has these LFOs modulating delay time and feedback. Just kind of spaces things out for a few seconds. Let's take a listen to this then with some test audio. First, I'm feeding in some marimba and then some synthesizer. You can see the pulses that trigger grains on the right side. So none of this is especially complex. It's just kind of like a series of probability gates. But stacking all the different stuff together results in this really chaotic, dynamic stream of pulses, which was the effect I wanted. So it's not total randomness, but it's definitely not like a contour, a predictable contour anyways. So how could I feed in material from the other sections into this patch? Again, I'm trying to get phase 3 audio into phase 4. So I felt like there was originally a system of recording audio to disk and then processing it, and this was going to be a tragedy. So instead, I looked at ways to move audio around inside Unreal and settled on using an audio bus. There are various ways to get audio in and out of audio buses, but here I'm using sends on the individual sources that I want to go into the bus and an audio bus reader node in the grain delay metasound. So now that I've got this audio into the grain delay, how do we shift it into the past? And this felt like a really sticky problem until I realized that all I was trying to do was just run some audio through a delay. Very simple. All I needed to do was start listening early in phase 3, delay the audio until the start of phase 4, and then it was good. So the result in the end was pretty cool. You get these kind of like distorted glimpses of material from the past that you'd heard before. I think this would translate really nicely to a setting where you have a player, for example, who's manually spawning grains that recall an audio buffer from the distant past. All right, so I hope this gave you some new ideas to try and some new perspective on procedural music, which, if it wasn't already obvious, I think is a very cool topic. I will leave you with some references of writings and games that I've found interesting and helpful. My favorite writing on procedural music is by Laurie Spiegel from the 80s and 90s. It is really hard to track down, but if you search the Internet Archive for her old website, retiree.org, there's a bunch of great writings there. I swear I wouldn't make you do something so annoying if it wasn't worth it. There's Brian Eno talk, also from the 90s, that's really great. And these games, I thought all these games have some really cool procedural stuff going on. And then lastly, please give Cycles a spin. It's free. I didn't even have time to play through a whole cycle. So if you check it out, I'd appreciate it. All right. I'm getting 2 thumbs up from the back. Thank you all so much for coming out. Asked some great questions. Appreciate it.